So welcome, panelists. Good to have you, some of you back. And Uri, thanks for stepping in. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You want to give yourself a quick intro since I don't think you spoke, right? We've heard from Ryan and Jan.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Do you want to give a quick intro? Since Ryan and Jan already spoke, I think they already were introduced, and then I'll introduce myself quick, and then we'll go get started.
Sure. So I'm Uli. I'm a member of a group called the Guild. We do a bunch of open source about GraphQL. Yeah, and happy to be here.
Great. Thank you all for joining. And I'm Kelly Gage. I'm CPO of Commerce Tools. And in January of this year, I wrote GraphQL for Modern Commerce. So it is near and dear to my heart. And I have Jan and the rest of the folks at Commerce Tools to thank for getting me interested in GraphQL. So with that, we do have some new folks joining us. Does anybody want to quickly explain what GraphQL is, since I'm not sure everybody made the first two talks here? Just a GraphQL in 30 seconds. Maybe Ryan?
Okay, 30 seconds or less. GraphQL is gives you a layer between your clients, your web client, your mobile apps, etc., the people who are using your app, and your database or other resources that would be behind your backend. And it gives you a way to access that data in a very nice fashion, which includes features like being able to select which fields you want to pull off of a query. So being specific about the data that you want to get back. It allows you to so be very specific about the data that you're getting access to, and it gives you as a developer a way to see what's available on an API as well, what you can do if you can do certain actions or not do certain actions. So it's, I guess, to sum up, and this is over 30 seconds, I know, a very a nice abstraction for interacting with an API.
A quick follow-up question for you. Some folks say that it's like SQL, but for APIs. Do you see the same analogy, or, how do you see it as being different or similar?
I don't think I would say that it is like SQL for APIs personally. I think there are enough differences between writing SQL and writing a GraphQL query that in the two, that would be a bit of a stretch for me. Yeah, so I would not say that it's like that. I don't have another thing to draw on to say what it is like, another analogy, but I guess I would tend to disagree with that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Anybody else want to take the other side of that argument?
Jan, I think you're muted.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. Do you want to speak, maybe, or should I?
No, you can go. I'll follow you.
Okay. So I guess if you want to have SQL consume directly SQL, and if you know about the trade-offs, then I think it's perfectly okay to do it. The thing is, when you have a public API, for example, your domain model that you expose is not the same as the domain model that you are persisting. And sometimes you want to change how you persist data, or you want to. So in GraphQL, you can also add some fields that are not persisted, but are only purely business logic. For example, discounts calculation, that everything that can happen on the server side. So that's kind of difference between SQL and GraphQL. Although they are quite similar because both are like your SDL to select data.
Yeah.
And in GraphQL, each field is a function. So a big difference is you can really change lots of behaviors by having variables into each field. For example, you can fetch an image, but you can also say, oh, I want this image, but only for this size, or I want for a bigger size. So it's GraphQL is very flexible in that place.
Yeah, I would add to that I think I understand why people are like associating the two, because both of them are query languages, and also, you can create a static schema and a static query, which gives you a lot of powerful abilities. GraphQL has a lot of differences, but I think the main thing, like if you're coming from SQL, you can maybe think about it also as like an SQL for anything. Like you could query, you can create a schema for basically any data. And it can be APIs, but it can be also directly for the database, and it can be from in memory. Like it can be for anything. So you can query, you can send queries to that data, but the data can basically be any data coming from anything. So.
Yeah. Can somebody take a question of, there are these terms that we've been using or that we will use. So there's the schema, there's the client, and there's the server. So over the course of a request, right, a query for GraphQL, somebody want to explain what those three pieces are and how they interact with each other?
Yeah, so my answer will be maybe someone else can take the classical answer for that, because my answer is a bit more complicated. I think I look at GraphQL as a bit more than just something between your client and server, and more than just an API. So maybe someone could take that part, and then later I can maybe talk about other parts.
At that part, and then you can follow up, Yuri, if you want to do that. Yeah, so there's these like different actors or players in this whole request lifecycle that you'd be thinking about when you're talking about interacting between a GraphQL client and a GraphQL API. And so the client would be, like I mentioned before, like your mobile application or your website, your web application. And the client needs to get some data, to display on the page and interact with and all that sort of thing. So it needs to make a request to the API, to the GraphQL API, which is then responsible for going out and getting that data from somewhere and then assembling it and serving it back to the client. So the GraphQL request that comes from the client, it takes a GraphQL document, a query document, which is then just kind of stringified and put into a post request, which gets made to the GraphQL API. That unwraps the GraphQL document that's received in the post request, looks at the fields that are being asked for, looks at what is trying to be done with it, and then makes a determination as to whether that can be fulfilled based on what that API knows. So this request that gets made, the document that gets sent, and the document is a GraphQL query. It's like it uses the GraphQL query language, the Graph query language to make this query asking for certain data, selecting certain fields. It has to be a valid document that gets sent and parsed on the back end. And if that's all good to go, then requests for data from the backend to a database or from the backend to another service downstream somewhere can be made, and then data gets aggregated, assembled, and then sent back to the client. So maybe a little difficult to describe without me having like a whiteboard to map it all out with, but that is more or less how I visualize it when I get that question.
Well said. Another question for you, Ryan. So, the whole concept of Prisma is exposing your data, basically an ORM replacement directly out to GraphQL. But, the title of this meetup is Microservices in GraphQL. And one of the cardinal rules of Microservices is not exposing your database directly to outsiders, right? So you have to go through the API to access the data. But Prisma's made a pretty big bet on the other side of that argument, saying that, hey, we should just expose our databases directly to GraphQL. So how do you square those two? Because obviously you're some smart folks over there. I'm sure I'm missing something. How do you square those two sides of that debate?
So one thing to clarify there is that what you described is more or less how Prisma used to work, especially going back to the GraphQL days when that was the product. It was describe your GraphQL schema, and we'll give you a database that you can access with GraphQL. Pivoted into a product where, okay, you describe your schema, you host your own database, we'll give you all this stuff to make it happen. It's still sort of like exposing your database via GraphQL. But now Prisma really is a database toolkit and an ORM, which means you don't directly expose your database. Instead, you have to write your GraphQL schema. If you're using GraphQL at all, you don't need to be using GraphQL. You can use a JSON. You can use JSON endpoints, a REST API, whatever you want, really. So now it's no longer this task of exposing your database. And part of the reason to switch to this whole thing that we're on now, which is like a much more broad abstraction for database access, is that, you know, it hits many other areas than just like the GraphQL world, but also there's like issues that exist when you're talking about exposing your database as a GraphQL API or any kind of API. And so like the canonical example, I suppose, would be like you have a users table, and if you expose that as an API, now you've got to do something to hide that password field or to get rid of all those other user details that you would not want automatically exposed via your API. And we run into this issue if we're one of the features of Nexus, which we've seen. And Nexus, again, is totally separate from Prisma, but they work really well together. One of the features of Nexus is this CRUD, this automatic CRUD generation. You can automatically generate a GraphQL schema based on what your database looks like. And so one of the issues there is that will automatically expose the password field unless you suppress it. So those are the kinds of challenges that exist around these services that are exposing your database as a GraphQL API. And one of the reasons that we decided to focus more broadly on strictly database access.
Great. Question for Jan, as I know you're very familiar with this topic, given some internal discussions, but you know, Apollo recently introduced Schema Federation as a replacement for schema stitching. Schema stitching was the original approach. So what is Schema Federation? What is stitching, and why is it necessary? And where do you come down on those two, or how do you approach that generally?
So the goal of Schema Federation, as I understand and experimented, is that you have different services, and each service has a GraphQL endpoint. And in one GraphQL endpoint, you can say, hey, my endpoint can extend a type from another endpoint. For example, I have the product service that gives products as a GraphQL API. I have categories, and the categories GraphQL can say, if you want, on products, you can extend the category and you will receive data from category. And on top of that, there is this GraphQL Federation gateway that will resolve this GraphQL request by sending requests to different GraphQL servers, to different GraphQL services. So the goal is to give autonomy to each service so that each service can expose a GraphQL endpoint, and that all those GraphQL endpoints are publicly exposed as if there were only one that was consistent from all services.
And a follow-up question.
Go
ahead.
I would like to add on that. So because your question suggested that schema stitching was deprecated in favor of Apollo Federation, which it's a common misconception in the community. The thing is, what happened since Apollo used to own GraphQL Tools library, which also had schema stitching, and then they decided to move to Apollo Federation and not support GraphQL Tools and schema stitching anymore. But what we've done is we took GraphQL Tools from Apollo and basically invested a lot in it and rebuilt it in the last year and a half. And we basically rebuilt schema stitching. And the reason we've done it is because, first of all, there's a lot of people that use schema stitching today because it's very valuable. And second of all, Apollo Federation doesn't really replace schema stitching. So Apollo Federation is a bit of a different concept than schema stitching. Like Jan said, this idea is the same, where you have multiple GraphQL servers, and then you expose them all as a single gateway. The thing is, with Federation, those single let's say, single GraphQL servers are not necessarily exactly a GraphQL server. So first of all, you add some new thing to the spec that is not part of the GraphQL spec. And second of all, part of the schema there, you're basically saying, this part of the schema is not actually in my service, it lives somewhere else. Now, what that means is that now those individual servers are not actually individual. They tie together, and you have to have some kind of an Apollo-specific tooling for them to live by themselves. And schema stitching is to take actual individual and encourage individual GraphQL services to live by themselves and be complete. And you can just, work by themselves and be isolated, and then you can merge them into one. So just to say that, first of all, schema stitching is not deprecated. Second of all, just yesterday, we released a very big blog post about GraphQL Tools version 7 that basically shows you why GraphQL schema stitching is actually a very interesting, let's say, option if you're looking into those solutions. And third thing is, we also published a couple of different very large companies like Vox Media that use schema stitching, the new schema stitching, and explains why they chose that over Apollo Federation. So
thank you for the nuance there.
Yeah, this is very interesting, because this is also what I thought, that schema stitching was deprecated and you better not touch it.
Yes, exactly. So I think there was many reasons why Apollo chose to frame it like that, but I don't know, it's their choice. But I think anyone who looks into, let's say, remote execution, because what we're really talking about here is federated or remote execution, meaning we won't have just one GraphQL engine and gateway. We're going to have a number of them and a connection between them. So if you're looking into that architecture, first of all, I would say, don't jump into it. Maybe you don't need it at all. Ask yourself if you really need a number of different executions, or you just want to separate that into separate teams, for example, with other tools like GraphQL modules, for example. Then you get a regular GraphQL execution, but you can still separate parts of the schema between different teams. So maybe you don't need it at all. But if you do need that, look very closely about what Apollo Federation does and what schema stitching does. And I'm not saying it's not this or not better or worse, but it's just different philosophies of how you should federate.
I like your advice. It's exactly what we are doing. We are using different GraphQL endpoints without any stitching or federation right now, but we are looking into it. And for me, for federation, one thing that would be great if the specification would be standard at some point, because now it's kind of tied to what Apollo decides, and I would like it to be a standard before feeling really confident to use it.
Yeah, it still feels early.
So I think so. If, let's say, everyone agreed that Apollo Federation was the only solution, then maybe it will be easier to push it into a standard. But if right now you're already seeing that, first of all, there's other options to solve the same problem, like schema stitching, which doesn't add anything to the spec itself. It's just GraphQL, and you can get the same architecture or benefits, or at least some of them, just in a different way. Or I don't know, Azura's remote joins. So once we'll take all of those worlds together and we let those be in the wild for a while, I think then we can look at standardization. I would be very much in favor, but I think until now there wasn't a lot of work. And from what we're seeing now, we have other tools that are actually using both stitching and federation. We need to still figure out, do you really need to divert from the spec or not? So there's still some questions there.
Yeah, that's good. So, there's another tension within the GraphQL, the philosophy of GraphQL, which is in a big enterprise, you have lots and lots of small teams, each building and exposing their own microservices, right? And potentially each contributing a part to a GraphQL schema. right? So you have this decentralized nature of development. That's the whole point of microservices, is you want these teams to be very independent. But GraphQL requires that you have a lot of common infrastructure. You have common syntax. You have common naming standards. You have a unified approach to things like checking query complexity, for example. So how do you split those two needs, where on one side you want this decentralized need and everyone innovates, but on the other side you want a cohesive experience for your clients when they're hitting your schema?
Yuri, I think you've got a good answer for this one.
I think first of all, actually, like there's a bigger assumption here, which I understand why people are looking into that, which means there's one schema, like one data schema for everything, and how each part can participate. I would argue that this is not. I look at it a bit different, let's say, and I think actually the transition that Prisma has done is very interesting in that regard. Like what we see now is that Prisma now started describing the schema of your data source, and that now there's a separate Prisma schema and a Nexus or GraphQL schema. And that's the same philosophy that we also work with. Like, we don't think there's one schema. We think there's actually your data sources schema or your microservices schema, which is just a simple merger of all those separate data sources. But then what your product needs is not necessarily that schema. It's something different. Like what your product needs is something different. So I think, so first of all, like, when you talk microservices, you need to ask yourself, am I talking about a team that builds just a data source and expose what the data source is capable of? Or I'm talking about a team that actually exposes part of that data into the product. And I think those are two separate schemas and two separate things. Maybe someone else can comment before I'll start the whole lecture here. So,
yeah, there are different approaches here. You can have one like gateway and using different services. You can also try that each service provides one part of the GraphQL API. Something that I like about you said is there must not be only one GraphQL schema or one GraphQL endpoint. I think this is something coming from Facebook did that because it worked for them, and that's great. But it doesn't mean that we have to do it also for ourselves. Sometimes it's also good to say, okay, I have these services and they are completely autonomous and independent from each other. Why not having two endpoints and using that? So I think there are different approaches here, and we have to leave all options open and look at the trade-offs to choose the right architecture.
Yeah, I still think you can merge those. Let's say two separate servers into one endpoint if you want. You don't necessarily have to. But I'm saying that even if you take them into one, so let's say sometimes when people talk services or microservices, they mean like really, at least from my approach, they're not thinking about a lot of teams building a gateway or a part of a product schema. They're thinking about teams that are responsible for some part of the data in the organization, and many different teams and many different products can consume them in many different ways. Now, first of all, there's a question: is GraphQL the right protocol to expose a microservice? Like, is a microservice just use GraphQL, or should it use gRPC or OpenAPI or something like that? There's trade-off here. Because GraphQL is very good between the client and the server for many reasons people talked about here, but there's a question of if it's good for the services. I personally think that if you take it with the regular way of writing GraphQL, it's not necessarily the best approach. But I do think that what you could do is you could get the best of both worlds, which I think not a lot of people are understanding that you can do. Meaning, let's say you have a microservice, and the best protocol for that microservice, for whatever reason, is gRPC. That means that that microservice has a schema. It's not a GraphQL schema, but I still can maybe do something with that schema. So with some tools, you can actually take the gRPC or OpenAPI schema, and you can generate a GraphQL schema out of it. And then you could, even if the service doesn't even know GraphQL, you could actually query it as if it was GraphQL and get all the benefits of asking for just the fields that you want in the shapes that you want. I'm pushing here for a tool that we built that's called GraphQL Mesh. But I think the concept here is more important. Like, first of all, think, what are the actual benefits, or what's the best protocol for each service? And then try to think, what would you want from GraphQL? And maybe you can get it without actually going and making all your services GraphQL. Maybe you can just use all your existing services and automatically query them GraphQL. So
yeah, that's fair. Yeah. So final question, maybe Ryan, you can start out answering and others chime in. But we here are in a bubble where we look at GraphQL all the time and we see GraphQL every day. If you look out, looking at Commerce Tools specifically, most of our big new enterprise customers, like folks who do more than $500 million a year online in e-commerce sales, most of them are using GraphQL now, which is amazing. I'm seeing it, but there's remarkably little discussion of it outside of some smaller circles. It's not a very visible technology. It's not very popular in terms of chatter on different community boards and things like that. Why does GraphQL not have a very visible profile yet out there? And why does your average CTO not know anything about it at all? Yet it's being used all over the place and it's exploding in popularity. Ryan, you want to take that one? Or I don't even know if you agree with me, but from what I've seen.
It's an interesting thing, right? Because it's almost as if there's like two tracks happening at the same time. It's a little bit like how in the world right now, a lot of people say we have two economies happening. One of the knowledge workers who are doing just fine, and then the people who need to work from physical locations, and that economy is not doing so well. It's like we're on these two tracks where GraphQL is doing really well. It's super well known. Everyone loves it in certain communities, but then there's this whole other set of developers that either don't know what it offers, they're confused about it, and it's just not really taken off there. I wonder if some of it comes down to messaging and maybe not communicating well enough the benefits that you would get out of GraphQL. I mean, it's easy to go over the cursory benefits, like take only the data that you want and know what your API looks like ahead of time. And that's compelling to some extent, but I think once you get a little bit beyond that, it becomes a bit murky, like what you're going to get out of GraphQL. And for organizations that are super entrenched in the technology that they have, switching to something like GraphQL is not a piece of cake. It's not a walk in the park, right? So perhaps like encouraging maybe more experimentation, and if there's a way to communicate that you can experiment piecemeal, doing small things at a time to really see the benefits of what you're going to get out of GraphQL. Also communicating the fact that if you are to adopt it, you don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to have this big bang migration to GraphQL. You can start to layer it into your existing tech stack. Maybe that's an approach, and that's to make the whole story of GraphQL a little bit more compelling. Those are some of the things that I see, but I'd definitely be curious to hear what others see as well.
Yeah, I 100% agree with everything that Ryan said. I would also add that I think, first of all, I see that growing. Like we work with a lot of large enterprises and companies that usually would think will adopt stuff very slowly, and somehow GraphQL, people get it. I think maybe because of the schema, maybe because of there's a lot of concepts that came from previous protocols that makes a lot of sense. I think that something that will really help would be maybe that we would share more stories about how to, just like Ryan said, like how to gradually adopt GraphQL. Like one of the, for example, I'll just give a small example. I can't say the name of the app, but we work with Microsoft on like a very, very large app, and they're using their GraphQL just on the client. And it helped them tremendously. So just the idea that you can start using GraphQL, getting a lot of the benefits on your products, and not even create a GraphQL server is something that most people don't know. So the buy-in is very easily. And once you proved that something is working on your client, then it's very easy to slowly convince others later on. So yeah, and other thing is that I think actually like the GraphQL.org and the foundations, all the actual core foundations assets used to move very slowly, but now recently we've started doing more work about exposing that to the community. Actually, Ryan helped us a lot, like both Prisma and the Guild are members of the foundation, of the GraphQL Foundation. And we're doing, if you even start following the GraphQL Twitter, we finally started making it work after years of that being silent. So we're starting to make a little bit of noise out there as well. So I hope things will change soon.
Great. Jan, you want to add anything quick, or everything captured already? That are you good?
I think everything captured. Just maybe when you want to start something, like you want to expose something on API, the REST API seems so simple at the beginning. You just take your endpoint and send some JSON, and that's all. And it's easier to start with. What people don't see is that even a REST API needs a lot of work to be a good REST API. And there's a lot of things. GraphQL is maybe more difficult to start with, but there's a lot of tools included. You have the schema, you have the documentation, you can bind a GraphQL on it, and you have auto-completion, everything. But you have to understand that you have to go through the initial steps and then see the advantages of using it.
Yeah. Very good. Well, with that, we will leave it there. Thank you all for participating, and let's turn it over to final quiz. So I think we're all set. Thanks.